So how do we ignore the things that don't matter and focus on the things that do matter? And I think for the human brain, that's really stories. Narratives are what kind of give us the through line that allow us to move through the world and take in all of this chaos of consciousness and know what to focus on and what to ignore and what to remember and what to forget and what to dream about. I think narrative is like really this, it's really this sort of port in the storm that lets us to kind of know what to prioritize. And I think that's what stories do for us. That's what storytellers like you do for us, is help us to kind of reframe our understanding of the world and know what is pertinent.
Hello, and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Julia Flynn Seiler. I'm an author and journalist and your moderator for this evening. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Priya Anand, award-winning author of The Mind Electric, a neurologist on the strangeness and wonder of our brains. Her wonderful book was awarded this year's PEN America E.O. Wilson Literary Science Award. And I understand why. It is a fabulous book. Dr. Anand is a neurologist at the Boston Medical Center and assistant professor at the Boston University School of Medicine. She's a graduate of Yale University and Stanford, and she trained in neurology, neuroinfectious diseases, and neuroimmunology. I can't even say that word.
It's a Mad Lib.
This is so above neurology. My head. Neuroimmunology at the Johns Hopkins Hospital and the Massachusetts General Hospital. So, Dr. Anand, I'm going to call you Priya, if that's okay.
Please do.
Okay. So I so enjoyed your book. I found it absolutely fascinating. And you begin the book with your childhood fascinations. You start talking about your grandfather's neurological symptoms from post-polio syndrome, and also the kind of fantastical tales that your older sister invented before you could even read. Tell us about those two threads and how they're related. Medical mysteries and storytelling.
First of all, thank you so much, Julia, for that lovely introduction. I'm so excited to be in conversation with you. And I learned recently that you are also a mystery fan.
Yes, I am.
And I'm so delighted to be here at the Commonwealth Club. I didn't come to medicine early in my life. I didn't know. I wasn't one of those children who kind of walks around with a stethoscope and knows that they want to be a doctor. But two things happened that sort of brought me to neurology. The one that happened later was that as I was going through medical school and trying to figure out what kind of doctor I wanted to be, my grandfather in India started to fall sick. And he fell sick in this really particular way. He was this really larger-than-life figure in my childhood. He made films for the Indian government and had spent his whole life in India, but somehow in the 40s, he had sort of charmed his way onto an American troop ship, bringing troops home after the war, and spent some time in Los Angeles. His stories were kind of the stuff of family myth and legend. And really he was an incredibly tall guy who really overshadowed my childhood. And when I was at the very beginning of my fourth year of medical school, he started to fall ill. And he fell ill in this very particular way. This larger-than-life person started to physically vanish. He started to lose his voice, his muscles. He was this profound extrovert who stopped leaving his home. And I kind of watched him really transform, his identity really be transformed by his illness. And I was visiting India and went with him to his neurologist. And this neurologist undressed him and examined him and saw the way that his muscles were twitching, heard the timbre of his voice, watched how he walked. And just from laying his hands on my grandfather and examining his body, he knew something about my grandfather that I, as his granddaughter, who thought I knew all of his wild and fantastical stories, didn't know, which is that my grandfather had grown up in this really tiny rural village in North India. He left school when he was a teenager. And at some point in that childhood, he contracted polio. He had childhood polio. And polio is a really funny thing. It leaves sort of a trace in the body that never quite completely goes away and can really resurge later in life. And I was so struck by this idea that our stories are written into our bodies. We carry our childhoods, we carry all of our memories really etched into our bodies for our whole lives. So in his 90s, he had this echo of a childhood infection. And that was so so moving to me because I exactly as you said, I was a child who loved stories. I loved fairy tales. My sister is here today, is an incredible storyteller and always has been. And I loved stories long before I knew that I loved medicine. And so the idea that there was a way that I could be a doctor that sort of sat at the intersection of honoring stories and bodies and illness really was moving to me.
It was a wonderful way to start the book, and I love your point that our life stories are etched into our bodies, and it's just fascinating. Your book is filled with people whose symptoms seem impossible until we understand the logic of the altered brain. Tell us about some of the cases you write about that changed your understanding of what a symptom can mean.
So one of the things I love about neurology, I think there's this, you could look at it in one way and think that, I think there's something voyeuristic about it. Like you're looking at these symptoms that feel so strange or so esoteric. But in another way, I think neurology is really about looking at the things that are universal, that make us all human. I think the brain is this really kind of protected black box, and it's not often that we get to pry open that black box and see the underpinnings of how our cognition works. And one of the moments we do that is actually when someone experiences a loss or someone experiences a trauma that causes them to lose some essential brain function. That's often how we learn a little bit about how our brains work when they're healthy and how all of our brains work. So one of the symptoms that I talk a lot about in the book, there's a feature of many, many different kinds of neurologic disorders, is the symptom of confabulation. Confabulation, I think, really speaks to the way in which stories are essentially universally human. So confabulation is essentially this impulse to tell stories that can be preserved even when someone loses their memory, their language, their strength. And what happens is that people who, for instance, become amnestic of their own life story, their brains are so wedded to this idea of a narrative order and this idea of story that their brains will fill in the gaps, the information that they're missing, with a story that has no grounding in the world around them, but is true for the person who's telling the story and fills in that missing information. I think our brains really treasure stories and coherence and narratives over accuracy or the truth. And that's one of the things that I think confabulation teaches us. There are many things about our current moment that I think confabulation might help to explain or teach us about. But I was so struck, again and again seeing this, I was so struck by the fact that you can lose so much, a human brain can lose so much and still really kind of treasure and honor this impulse and desire to tell stories. And so I sometimes, my favorite question to ask someone who's struggling with their memory, sometimes I'll ask someone, have we met before? And I'll get these stories that are so beautiful and vivid that any novelist would envy. So stories about how we were childhood sweethearts, or we played in the big football game together. Some really detailed, intricate story about a relationship that this person's brain is giving them to kind of give coherence and to give them a narrative to hold on to. And I think, in that vein of symptoms telling us something about what's universal about all of our brains, I think confabulation tells us that stories are really a human universal.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us a specific example of confabulation? Perhaps you tell a story, a very moving story of a young woman who was losing her eyesight. And maybe tell us a little bit about the kind of story she came up with to explain what was happening to her.
Absolutely. So one of the stories that I talk about in the book is actually a young woman who developed an autoimmune disease. So she developed a disease that's very, very similar to multiple sclerosis that affected the vision in both of her eyes. And what was so profound and interesting about her experience is that she started to lose her vision. And she was a person who had grown up going to this really, really devout Orthodox church. She was part of this really devout church community. And she had a story to explain the way that she was losing her vision. So she believed that she had stolen a kiss in the church parking lot before she started to lose her vision. And she felt as though she had been cursed for this stolen kiss. And I had these explanations that had to do with electrons and neurons and neural signaling. And I think, it's so interesting because I think my explanations are really also about faith in something that I am not able to see or can't show, and really also rest on belief. I think that all of these stories are ways of making sense of the world, and there's some, there's really value in a story that's true for the person who's experiencing it. The symptoms that she experienced, she lost her vision, and she had a way of explaining that symptom. And I think, all of us, everyone is kind of prone to some form of confabulation. Everyone is prone to telling stories to explain things that feel senseless, or explain things that are beyond our control, our capacity to understand. And that's true for so many different illnesses. There are all of these really rich, kind of detailed, textured cultural and spiritual narratives to explain illness. One of my favorite examples is the example of sleep paralysis, and I love thinking about sleep paralysis because it's something that is so profoundly common. So many people, perhaps in this audience, have experienced it. Something like 1 in 10 people will have it at some point in the course of their lives, and it's a really profound experience for people who have it. So people describe the experience of feeling trapped in their body, the experience of seeing kind of shadowy, dreamy figures just out of their range of sight, and hearing kind of strange noises, feeling like they're being lifted from their beds. It's this really otherworldly experience. And I could tell you something about what happens in your spinal cord when you experience sleep paralysis, but if you've experienced it, you might tell me that really misses the point. This set of receptors really misses the point of this otherworldly experience. But because it is so common, every cultural tradition has a narrative to explain this experience of sleep paralysis. It is a witch, or it is sorcery, or it is a spell that's cast. I have a colleague in Boston who cares for, whose patients are primarily Cambodian refugees, and he surveyed his patients about what their experiences of sleep paralysis were. And many of his patients described the experience of sleep paralysis as a person in a Khmer Rouge uniform holding them down in their beds. The way that this experience is, I think, physiologically is the same regardless of who you are, and it comes down to the same set of receptors, but it means something different for everyone. And there's a truth to those ways of experiencing it. There's something about the experience that's captured by these stories that the textbooks miss, and sort of vice versa. I think there's a truth in all of these different ways of understanding illness.
Well, then that brings me to my question. You write that stories are etched into the very structure of our brains, and they're coded so deeply that the impulse for storytelling survives and even surges after the most devastating injuries. So I guess, what does that survival tell us about why we are storytellers, why we're born to tell stories? Why does this? I'm a storyteller. Tell me, doctor, why do we tell
what
stories?
What is my pathology? So it is a really universal. So I think I've come to believe in the course of doing this work that more than language, more than culture, more than art, I think stories are the human universal. Fables and folklore and all of these different ways of understanding the world. So we understand that stories are etched into the brain in part because when something is wounded, that gives us a chance to pry open the black box of the brain. So the kind of our understanding of confabulation dates back to a few physicians in the late 19th century. So the first was a German neuropsychiatry resident who cared for patients in a hospital who had been affected by late-stage syphilis. So his patients had syphilis often from the time they were young adults, and over time this spiraling bacteria kind of wended its way into their brains and robbed them of their memories. And he realized that he was so focused on what his patients had lost, their memories, that what he didn't realize was how much they seemed to have gained. They had all of these excesses as well. And these excesses were all in the form of stories. His patients would look around at the pillared wall of this hospital where they were kept. They couldn't remember that they were there because they were sick, but they would construct these stories about how they were there to be married. They were there to be hanged. They were in a royal court. All of these really elaborate narratives to explain where they were and why. And a few years later, a Russian neuropsychologist in the north of Moscow wrote about a patient of his who he calls in his text, he just calls him the learned man. But the learned man was a writer. He was actually a Russian journalist. And he had this nasty habit of medicating his writer's block with brandy. And as a consequence of all the brandy, he developed this profound vitamin deficiency that robbed him of his memory. And when he was hospitalized, he could remember, he could win a game of checkers or chess and then forget as soon as the board was cleared away that he had ever played. And he too told these really elaborate stories of, how he had wound up there, places he'd gone the previous day, when in reality he'd been too sick to leave his bed. And I think when I first read this, I thought maybe this kind of storytelling pathology is unique to writers, or maybe it's a pathology of writers. But now I think it's a pathology of doctors too. It's really, really profoundly universal, because I think, so much of what we struggle to understand about the brain is, we are capable of taking in, we're able to perceive so much. And I think the question then becomes not how do we take information in, but how do we attend to what is salient? So how do we ignore the things that don't matter and focus on the things that do matter? And I think for the human brain, that's really stories. Narratives are what kind of give us the through line that allow us to move through the world and take in all of this chaos of consciousness and know what to focus on and what to ignore and what to remember and what to forget and what to dream about. I think narrative is like really this, it's really this sort of port in the storm that lets us to kind of know what to prioritize. And I think that's what stories do for us. That's what storytellers like you do for us, is help us to kind of reframe our understanding of the world and know what is pertinent.
Beautifully put. I want to commend your book, because it's not just science writing. It's not just beautiful science writing. You weave in your own story and your own journey as a physician. You weave in deep reading of literature as well. And I particularly enjoyed that part. And so I guess that brings me to my next question, which is that as a physician, you're trained to learn about the electrical impulses that cause this and that in the brain. Sorry, I don't even have the language to describe what you do as a neurologist. At the same time, you're somebody who believes in the power of stories. So how do you balance that as a physician? When you see a patient who is confabulating, who is telling a story about something that bears, from perhaps your scientific perspective, no relation to the reality of his or her situation, how do you grapple with those two things?
It's interesting. I think so much of medicine is about, acquiring the humility to realize that more than one thing can be true for someone at the same time. Yeah. It can be both and. It can be this electrical signaling gone haywire, and it can also be, for the person who's experiencing it, it can feel something much, much bigger than the set of electrical impulses. And I think the gift that writing this book gave me was the chance to spend a lot of time steeped in medical history and see the ways that doctors are really just telling stories to try and understand illness as well. So I live in Boston, and one of my favorite examples that didn't make it into the book, but that I tell anyone who is willing to listen, is the story of the New England vampires. And so, in the corner of the world where I live in New England, especially in Massachusetts and southern Vermont and northern Rhode Island, there was for a long time in the 19th century, this thought that consumption, which was the disease that was kind of raging through these small farming towns in New England, which we now know is tuberculosis, the thought was that this disease didn't seem to make sense. It seemed like it could cluster in some homes and spare others. It could sometimes take years and years to rear its head. Sometimes it would fell entire families, but leave just one person alive. And to make sense of this illness, people in these communities started telling this story. They told the story that consumption was actually caused by vampirism. So it was that one member of the family would die, and from beyond the grave, they would suck the life force from their living relatives. And if you think about it, it makes a sort of sense, this idea that,
a metaphor.
A metaphor, right? Like you're leaving people pale, and it really kind of takes hold at night, and it robs people of their breath. It seemed to explain some of the really profound features of this illness. And doctors were saying, these New England villagers, they are full of nonsense. They have no idea what's going on. They're so superstitious. But doctors at the same exact same moment of history were sending people with tuberculosis to the tops of mountains and the bottoms of caves and the seaside, because they were telling a different story about this disease that they also didn't quite fully understand. They were telling a story about how it was a disease of damp lungs that needed to be dried out, and they were prescribing all kinds of bizarre tonics and strange treatments. And I was so struck by this example because I think in many ways, science also requires stories, but I think what science has is a narrative humility. Science requires stories that can rewrite themselves and can self-correct. And I think this idea that like the first draft of science doesn't always nail it on the head. It's an explanatory model. It's a story to try and understand something, but it has to be able to correct itself. I think is something that is a really like hard-won wisdom in medicine. And I think understanding that kind of gives. I think allows, when medicine is done well, allows you the humility to say that there can be many different stories that capture something about the truth.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I like that point a lot. So as someone who writes biography and narrative nonfiction, this is the question that really lingered with me after I finished your book, which is if a damaged brain invents narrative to paper over what's been lost, how different, in a way, is that from those of us who tell a story of our own lives, to paper over losses, to deal with grief, really, what's the difference?
That's a great, I think everything is I think if I've learned anything within the walls of a hospital, it is that nothing is a binary. There's not, a symptom and normal. There are all of these different human ways of making sense of the world. And I think, you're exactly right. We all tell stories about our own lives. We tell stories to make sense of things and to find meaning in things. I think that's really a uniquely human superpower. It's also really uniquely human vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And I think, that I think the human brain is so hungry for a good story. And sometimes that's a story with easy villains and easy heroes. And it's not always a story that serves us. It's not always the story that is, that is grounded in reality. But that's how our brains are wired, is to look for a story to make sense of things. Yeah. And I think it's sort of the way that you tell your own story. Many different stories of someone's life could be true. You could write that story in so many different ways, and it could mean so many different things, which is why what you do is really an art. There's a narrative art to what you do, because it's not just translating a set of facts, because I think people's lives are so much more complicated than that.
Yes, no binaries.
No binaries, no exactly.
Binaries so strangeness is in your subtitle, but the strangest symptoms often illuminate something ordinary and universal. So what has an apparently bizarre symptom taught you about the rest of us?
That is a great, so I think confabulation is a great example. And I think there's so many symptoms that are similar to that. So for instance, so kind of to give you one example from the book. So one of the kind of historical medical texts that I became fascinated with was a 19th century psychiatry text about a woman named Madame M. That's how she's named in this text. And she was this woman who had this really kind of gruesome set of traumatic experiences. She lost many of her children in childbirth, was committed to an institution, and developed this belief that people around her were being replaced by identical doubles. So she looked around her and she would see people who had the face of someone she loved or knew, her husband or her doctor, and she believed that person had been substituted by someone else who looked just like them, but wasn't familiar to her. And on the surface, that's such a strange thing to believe, and such a frightening thing to believe about the world around you being transformed and substituted. But what we've learned, I think, from that, from her experience, from the experience of people who've had similar kind of symptoms, and from people who've had almost the opposite, people who have lost their memory but retain that sense of familiarity, what we've learned is that familiarity and memory are not necessarily part and parcel of the same thing. You can remember the features of someone's face, but not necessarily have that sensation of recognition or feeling like you've, met someone before, that sensation of warmth that you feel when you see a familiar person or a loved one. So I love that example, because I think it feels like it's out of some sort of like, Grimm's fairy tale, this sense, this really embattled feeling of everyone around you being replaced. But sort of as you start to parse it out, it tells us something that you can lose a sense of familiarity and still remember someone's face. That tells us something really, really profound about how the human brain prioritizes relationships, what it values, and how it kind of separates, kind of organizes our connections with other people.
Absolutely. Ooh. So you write in the history of medicine that some stories are heard while other stories, such as the narratives of women, of Black people, of brown people, of displaced and disempowered people, are too often dismissed. I found this in writing about girls and women who had been trafficked in my book, The White Devil's Daughters. How does a doctor learn to hear the story she's been trained to discount? If everything is telling you some stories aren't to be believed, how do you counter that?
It's what's so hard is that this is something that's so deeply rooted into the history of medicine. And there are many, many different examples. The example in neurology that I often think about is, so the history of modern neurology owes its origins to one hospital in Paris called a Salpêtrière. Salpêtrière was a gunpowder factory that was turned into a women's asylum. And women would be institutionalized there for their whole lives because they had children out of wedlock, because they were old, because they were poor, because they, for any number of reasons, but many of them developed illness while they were at this hospital. They spent their whole lives there, and when they died, there was a neurologist there who autopsied their brains. And much of what we know about neurology comes from this asylum where these women were institutionalized. Wow. And this neurologist, his passion, the thing that he was trying to understand, was the neurologic basis of what he called hysteria. Oh. And there's this long tradition of thinking about hysteria in medicine and categorizing women's symptoms. I think doctors are very much like dualists. Like doctors really want to be biologists, but I think we often still think about the mind and the body as something separate. And I think,
so Priya, let's just stop there. What is the definition of hysteria, at least in this context?
So in this particular institution, this neurologist would, he describes hysteria as this sort of performance of symptoms. And he would bring these women out on stage and parade them before an audience, and he would have them kind of perform their symptoms. But the origins of hysteria date back, the term hysteria dates back to, there's a kind of a Hippocratic vision of hysteria, which is this idea that a woman's womb could wander anywhere in her body and cause symptoms that manifested in her brain or in her chest or in her arms or in her legs that could make her weak. But really the pathology was her womanliness, her femaleness, that her womb was kind of wandering throughout her body. And over years and years, that kind of like core idea, this idea that women were prone to having symptoms that were not real or that were misplaced, has really persisted in the history of medicine. And I bring up the Salpêtrière because we learned a lot about neurologic illness from this neurologist, Jean-Martin Charcot's, from his studies. One of the diseases that he first described was multiple sclerosis. So in the women under his care, he did these autopsies and found the scleroses of multiple sclerosis. And he described it as a disease among the women in his care. And multiple sclerosis is indeed a disease that's much more common among women than men. It's something like 4-to-1 women versus men who develop multiple sclerosis. But for years after this disease was first discovered, women would go to a doctor and say, I'm having this symptom, I can't see out of my right eye, or I'm falling on my right leg, and the doctor would say, you're hysterical. And men would go to a doctor and say, I can't see out of my right eye, and the doctor would say, what's wrong with your eye? And medicine thought for years that multiple sclerosis was a disease of men. And I think it really speaks to like the fact that it matters whose stories you hear, because that actually influences the way that we like think about our science, and completely, misleads us when we disregard sort of some stories and center others. And I think it's a constant work in progress. I don't think there's any, I sometimes think about what doctors 5 years from now and 10 years from now, and what people living 5 or 10 years from now will feel about the way that we practice medicine now, and which stories we honor and think about, and which ones we don't choose to hear.
Mm-hmm. Your book may change the way we think about that. Are there other factors that might change whose stories we listen to, whose stories doctors listen to?
I hope that something that will change whose stories we listen to is just the fact that I think that there's an expanding pool of identities in doctoring. And so doctors, there are more women than men who are entering medical school now, and more women than men who are becoming many different kinds of doctors. And so just the idea of existing in a body, existing in more diverse bodies, I think hopefully will help to expand or like make medicine a little bit more expansive. The other thing I think that's really interesting is I feel like we're entering this moment where people are able to think about their own bodies and their own illnesses and be a part of rewriting the story of their own illnesses. And so, a journalist and writer that I love, Susanna Cahalan, is a great example. So she, I think, spoke at the Commonwealth Club not too long ago about one of her new books. But she is this incredible journalist who wrote the story of her own experience with a syndrome called autoimmune encephalitis. So she had this autoimmune disease.
And her book was called Brain on Fire.
And her book was called Brain on Fire. She had this disease that affected the structures of her brain that help with memory, that help to regulate your mood, that help with language. And the symptoms of this illness often present with what seems like a really profound psychosis, mania. So people really lose their identity. And this is for various biological reasons. This is often a disease of young women. It often happens in women who have a type of tumor of the ovary. And that kind of tumor has brain tissue in it, and their immune systems overreact to the tumor and affect their own brains. And for years, this is something that landed women in psychiatric hospitals without treatment. And I think just the idea that this person can write the story of her own experience is so, so powerful. I think so many people have this illness is in the zeitgeist because Susanna was brave enough to tell the story of her own, to tell her own story. So I think it matters who writes the stories that we consume.
Absolutely. I think you're very right about that. So a diagnosis can explain suffering and open the door to treatment, but it can also reduce a person to a category. So when is a diagnosis serving the patient, and when is it mainly serving the institution?
It's a really hard question. A diagnosis is a word, and it's really hard to So I think diagnoses are not natural kinds. They're something that we as medicine invents to make it easier to categorize symptoms and to categorize experiences. And there are scientists and writers who really have thought very deeply about how diagnoses can serve us and when they can really flatten the experience of illness. I think in neurology, sometimes a diagnosis can be a gift. Sometimes it can feel like a crystal ball, or it can feel like a validation of what you're experiencing in your own body. It can feel like a prediction of the future, which I think can feel magical. But sometimes I think it can it can reduce the richness of your experience. I think the example of sleep paralysis is one. My colleague, Tanya Luhrmann, who's an anthropologist, writes about the experience of hearing voices across different cultures. And she actually did a study here in California, as well as in Accra, Ghana, and in Chennai, India. She looked at how people who would be given a diagnosis of schizophrenia here in the United States experienced hearing voices. And across these different cultures, people had these radically different experiences of hearing voices. So the patients that she spoke to in California had this experience that these voices that they were hearing were painful and threatening. She spoke with people who were were part of other traditions where they felt like they were hearing the voices of ancestors, the voices of gods. There was this whole range of experiences of how people categorized their own symptoms. And I think it just speaks to the fact that I think a diagnosis can flatten what is a really rich experience, and an experience that's not just physiology, but also is culture and your life story and your history. All of those things, I think, influence how you experience symptoms.
I particularly enjoyed your references to Virginia Woolf, who of course suffered in a number of different ways with mental health problems, ended up killing herself. But she had such a rich view of the world and left us with so much. Could you speak to us a little bit about Virginia Woolf and how you brought her into your book?
She is absolutely brilliant. I think I spoke about a couple of my favorite of her sort of stranger and smaller books in this. The Waves is one of my favorite of Virginia Woolf's books, and it's this book that she calls, it's this strange sort of poem prose that she calls eyeless. It's a book that moves between different perspectives, and there's no kind of authoritative version of the story. So everyone is experiencing the same thing. So all of the characters, for instance, are on a beach, and everyone's experiencing the same external world, but everyone's inner narrative of it is so radically different. And I think she was able to write that. I think, she has described her experience of hearing voices, and she calls herself, when she writes about her own experience of hearing voices, she describes herself as being porous. And that was, I think, very painful for her, that she felt like she was so sort of porous or open to all of these different persexual experiences. It was something that was painful for her, but also I think animated her writing. It gave her this profound sense of empathy in a way that's that has really sort of survived and made her writing feel much more timeless than it might otherwise have been. And I think there's like some, back to this idea that there's something that stories can tell us that textbooks don't always tell us. I think her, you can learn something about this experience of voice hearing from reading her books that you might not be able to learn from reading the DSM or from reading a textbook. There's something true that she captures about that experience.
You also refer early on in your book to Scheherazade, and tell us why that was resonant for you and meaningful in your exploration of the mind electric.
Yes. So so as a child, I loved the Arabian Nights. I loved all of the fantastical tales that my sister told me and all the ones that I read in children's books. But the Arabian Nights was one of my favorites. And the Arabian Nights is really fascinating because it's born out of various oral traditions, and it has kind of moved across North Africa and South Asia, and stories have been added and subtracted and mutated over time. And there's no authoritative version. You can't point to one version and say, this is the true version of the Arabian Nights. But every time that it's told, the Arabian Nights has the same framing. And the framing is this. So there is this kingdom where there is this really monstrous king who every night weds a new woman and before dawn becomes bored and has her executed. And in this kingdom, there's a brave young woman, Scheherazade, who sacrifices herself. She volunteers herself to be wedded to this king to end this tradition. And on the night that she marries him, she says, I know that I may not live to see the dawn. I have just one last request. I want to tell a bedtime story to my sister. And she has her sister brought into this bedchamber, and the king is sort of sitting in the corner listening. And she weaves this bedtime story for her sister. And there's this marvelous story full of magic and jinn and sorcery and spells. And she tells the story, and just as dawn breaks, she stops the story and she ends it on a cliffhanger. And the king is so curious that he lets her live another night so he can hear how the story ends. And the next night she does it again, and she does it again and again and again for 1,001 nights. That's the 1,001 Arabian Nights. And at the end of all those nights, this king is so moved by all the stories that she's told, by her ingenuity, by her insight, that he lets her live and ends this tradition. But I think I love, there is a quote from William Osler, a very famous internist who kind of birthed the idea of medical residencies. He says that to talk of illnesses is a sort of Arabian Nights entertainment. When I first heard that quote, I was appalled. I was like, illnesses are not a source of entertainment. But I think reflecting on that story, this idea that stories are what keep us alive. Stories are what help us to find meaning. Stories are what kind of bridge us from one night to the next. I think Scheherazade is like the canonical, in some ways, the canonical example of stories giving us life. And so I think there's a real, I don't know if this is what William Osler meant, but I'm going to choose to interpret his quote charitably and say that he was speaking of Scheherazade and how important it is to think about the storyteller as well as the story.
Yes, yes. And what strikes me, too, is just in your book, the empathy and the wide reading that you bring. And could you talk a little bit about, again, your personal journey, what you learned from the very earliest days of being a doctor in training to being now an assistant professor? What have you learned about listening to stories?
I think the biggest thing that has changed in the course of my practice is just my degree of certainty, and not in the way that I expected. I think.
So tell me more about that.
I think that sort of spending more time in the hospital has made me less certain, or has made me embrace uncertainty more. And I think I started out in medical training, and I imagined that I was just like one layer of training or 1 year of training away from knowing the answer to all of these things and being able to say very decisively what was happening and what would happen to someone. And I think the longer that I've done this, the more that I realize that there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in medicine, and that I think there's a real power in naming that. I think that's how science moves forward, is by acknowledging that uncertainty. And it's also how we can better serve people who are having all different experiences. It's by leaving room for uncertainty. I think that's the kind of the biggest sort of change that I've experienced. And that uncertainty extends in ways that I never imagined. I imagined when I started my medical training that, you were either sick or well, and it turns out that there's a whole vast gray area between sick and well. There's a vast gray area between alive and dead. Even there's this vast gray area between symptom and kind of just the range of human experience. And so all of those things, I would say I have learned to think about all of the gray areas in our bodies and in our minds.
Yes. There are some wonderful questions here, so I think we're going to turn to questions. Sure. Several chapters connect brain science to language, culture, and even poetry. What is it about neurology specifically that keeps leading you back to literature?
That is a wonderful question. This is such a strange book because, as you said, it's not a book just of science. It's a book also of fables and poetry and Virginia Woolf and Dostoevsky and
very rich, deep book.
It covers a lot of ground. So I hope there's something in it for everyone. If you're wondering whether there's something in it for you, but that's a wonderful question. I think neurology is really preoccupied with questions about what makes us human. So neurologists are interested in when someone loses their language, what is it that happens and how can they recover that? Or how can we preserve language? How can we preserve stories? How can we preserve someone's perception or their vision? These are all the things that help us to create art and culture and literature. And so it is, I think, more than any other part of medicine, I feel like it's so entwined with culture and philosophy in a way that's impossible to disentangle. So I think it's hard to be a neurologist and not find yourself coming back to stories.
Mm-hmm. Oh my goodness. I think your sister wrote all these wonderful questions because they're pretty good questions. So all in the same handwriting. Yeah. Okay. A theme that runs through the book is how much of diagnosis depends on belief, whether it's patient's faith, a doctor's certainty, we were just talking about that, or cultural frameworks. What did writing this book teach you about the limits of purely biomedical explanations? Really something you just talked about, but
yes. I think so I think that there is. So for instance, in medicine, you can ask the question, sometimes the question comes up, like someone experiences a brain injury and the question comes up, is this person going to recover in a meaningful way? Mm-hmm. And I think the where that gets sticky is I think what that means is so radically different for every person in every life. There is all of these complications to what it means to live meaningfully, what it means to interact with the world in a meaningful way. And I think that's a profound limit of biomedical science, that there's no sort of universal set of values that can animate how someone experiences illness, no matter how hard we can try to reduce it down to a set of labels or a set of diagnoses or a set of receptors. Mm-hmm. There's always something that's much more complicated and that is so deeply personal and deeply intimate that it's difficult to reduce to biomedical science.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's keep going through these next questions. Several patients in the book are only partly believed at first, their symptoms dismissed, misread, or explained away. How do you now try to guard against that instinct yourself?
That's such a fantastic question. And I think this goes back to some of what you were asking earlier about this question of whose stories are believed and how that extends beyond medicine and is an animating force in your work as well. I think, I think that the sort of having a broader range of stories, so stories like Susanna's, stories like, there was recently an article in the New England Journal of Medicine that was called "The Patient Scientist Mandate." It's an amazing story by a woman named Sonia Valeb, who's in Boston, where I practice medicine, who was writing about the experience of trying to understand and find a treatment for a disease that runs in her family that she knows that she will develop later in her life, and this idea that people are like now, I think. Able to form community around something that they're experiencing themselves and are animating and partners in research and science and propelling forward medicine. I think that's a huge protection against medicine ignoring or forgetting or kind of overlooking stories that are less expedient or that are less easy to understand or parse. Mm-hmm. So I think the patient scientist mandate hopefully will protect us.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, and it's getting so much more complex, doesn't it, with the predictive values of certain genetic testing and, can we figure out if we're going to get dementia or we're going to get Alzheimer's, and how do you build around that? And what stories and community do you build around that?
It's so interesting. I think, and genetic testing it's so interesting to me because I think it really highlights, again, the limits of biomedical science in the sense that there is still this mystery at the core of genetic medicine. Like, we imagine genetics as a way of predicting the future, but really, like, you can take multiple siblings in the same family who all have the same genetic mutation, and they might progress very, very differently. They might experience really radically different symptoms at very different paces, at very different ages. There's this core sort of mystery at the center of genetic medicine, which is also sort of, how can you, to what extent does it really predict someone's fate, and to what extent are stories like not easily captured by kind of our simplistic testing?
Yep. Yeah. Oh my goodness, so many good questions. Okay. It's hard to decide which one. Oh, okay. Okay. In addition to being, we were talking about this beforehand, in addition to being an accomplished physician and author, you're also a mother. What has most surprised you about your lived neurological experience of motherhood, or your observations about the neurological lives of children?
Oh my goodness! Someone needs to tell me. Someone needs to help me learn about the neurological lives of children. I started writing this book a few weeks after I gave birth to my first child. The book found an editor 2 weeks before I gave birth to my second child, and I came home from the hospital. I didn't write that day, but then the next day and every day after, I was so terrified that someone was going to get sick or something I was never going to sleep again, and I was never going to be able to finish the book. And so it really is, there's a lot of motherhood in this book and a lot of the experience of being in a pregnant body. And I think the biggest thing is I went through a residency program where I didn't even have plans. Like, every third or fourth day, I would work a 30-hour shift. I didn't have a dog. I didn't have anything to take care of. I really was living at the hospital and giving everything of myself to the hospital. And that felt like my entire identity. And that felt like more than enough to be a neurologist. And I was so terrified when I wanted to have a baby, and I was so excited to find out that I was pregnant, but I was also terrified because it felt like I was about to lose this identity that had defined me for all of these years. And I think what I didn't expect, what has really surprised me about motherhood and how it intersects with doctoring is just that it never occurred to me that having the experience of becoming a mother, and I think it's a different experience for every person. It doesn't have to be becoming a parent. It could be caring for a relative. It could be anything. But having the experience of becoming a mother, it shed my work in new light. So suddenly I feel like I had a completely different understanding of the stakes of illness. I feel like I thought about doctoring in a totally different way. It was like I was understanding my work with color vision where it had previously been black and white in a way that I hadn't predicted. So I think there is, I think this idea of like being open to things that might challenge your identity or expand your perspective of your worldview. I think that's a big thing that motherhood has taught me. And the experience of pregnancy, it is wild. There are so many,
Tell us more.
Like inhabiting a pregnant body, the fact that so many people in this room have had the experience of pregnancy and we just go on with our lives. Just even sort of like restless legs, all of the ways that I never dreamed before I was pregnant for the first time. And so all of these ways that my own body changed, I think really highlighted that vast gray area that bodies and kind of the phenomenology of our bodies changing is not just limited to, are you sick or are you well? It's so much richer than that.
Ooh, yeah. How much can eating, nutrition, and exercise really improve how the brain functions or improves?
That is a great question. So I feel like that this whole neurologists for years and years have been thinking about, about illnesses of the brain, and this idea of thinking about brain health is shockingly recent in the kind of the medical zeitgeist. But I think there are some really extreme examples. So the example that I gave of the Russian writer who lost his memory, that's actually, we now understand that illness that he experienced, we thought for a long time that it was caused by a toxin that might be contained in alcohol, but it's actually caused by a vitamin deficiency. So not absorbing a particular B vitamin can is so essential to the functions of the structures of your brain that form memories that it can actually give rise to the syndrome of amnesia. So there are these really profound examples and really, really interesting examples that kind of come from moments of famine or moments of really kind of like nutritional deprivation that help us to understand how essential things like eating, things like exercise, sleep is an essential one that I never valued.
Speaking of parenthood.
Speaking of parenthood. There are these really fascinating series of experiments by this woman who, a Russian biochemist who sort of was maybe one of the first women in biochemistry, although I think her work was never acknowledged as it should have been, Maria Manasena. But she wrote this, she was one of the first scientists to ever think about sleep. For the longest time, we thought that sleep was just like, you were awake and there was all this interesting physiology, and then you closed your eyes, everything shut off, and then you woke up again and you carried on your life. And she wrote this book at the end of the 18th century called Sleeping a Third of Human Life. And it was about how essential sleep was. She did these experiments that would never pass any IRB today, where she took animals, she took puppies, and she saw what happened to their brains when they didn't get food and when they didn't get sleep. And the sleep was much more essential to the health of their brains than even food. All of these things that we sort of take for granted, I think, are really essential to how we function.
So doctor's orders get a lot of sleep.
Doctor's orders get a lot of sleep. Tell your toddlers to get a lot of sleep too. Yeah.
if they'll listen to you. Another question for you. It's interesting that the damaged mind tells beautiful stories. Other than not being grounded in the real, what stands out about your patient's stories? How do we become better storytellers with our current minds? Is there something we can unlock?
That's such a fantastic question. I think I said earlier that I think storytelling is really a human superpower and also a human vulnerability. And I think it's really important to realize how susceptible we are to stories. So I think, especially in this current moment, there's a real hunger for stories to explain things that feel like they are senseless tragedies, or to explain things that feel like they are beyond our scope. And realizing that is that is something about the way that our brains are wired encourages us to seek out these stories, whether or not they're grounded in the truth. I think it's really, really important to understand about ourselves. And it's really hard to do that. It's really hard to kind of like take a step outside of your body and your brain and see the way that you're, that you're kind of subject to or vulnerable to something that doesn't necessarily serve you or doesn't necessarily kind of bring you closer to understanding the world or to truth.
So you're saying that politicians can manipulate our human tendency towards confabulation.
I think that I think that like the best politicians really have an eye for that, have a gift for it, have a gift for tapping into that really human desire for stories.
And maybe we need to push back a little more. Something.
Or even yes, I think just like recognizing it in ourselves. I think it's really interesting. I feel like a conversation that I've had a lot since I've been here in the Bay Area over these last days is about AI and confabulations. This comes up all of the time.
Let's talk about that. That's a good one.
So many people in this room are much, much better informed than I am. So everyone feel free to stand up and yell if I'm saying something incorrect. But I was recently working on an essay about human confabulations and had the chance to speak to some folks who work in trying to understand how we can do better when it comes to the accuracy of these large language models. And it seems like maybe stories are like a really essential feature of any kind of intelligence. This idea that that something that we've created is creating stories or confabulating in lieu of confessing uncertainty feels like such a profoundly human failing,
So are confabulations, could you substitute that for hallucinations that AI has? How are you using the term?
So I like the word confabulations better than hallucinations, because I think hallucinations are really like a perceptual experience. So when human beings have a hallucination, that is a perceptual experience, something that you see or something tactile, something that you feel or that you hear that is unmoored from reality. Whereas confabulation is this idea of a story that's unmoored from reality. And I think there's something that captures much more this sort of false narrative aspect of what these LLMs are doing, whereas hallucinations are so experiential. You know, a human hallucination is so experiential that I still am not ready to apply that that language to something that's not human. Although someone could persuade me otherwise. Yeah.
Confabulations, do they tend to simplify the world in a sense? Are they self-soothing in some ways?
It's interesting. So there's a whole range of different kinds of confabulations. And if you look back at some of those early descriptions, what's interesting is that some of them are larger than life. They're fantastical. So there are people who, in that hospital being treated for syphilis, who believed that they were Peter the Great, who believed that they had all of these really
In
grandiose.
San Francisco, we have Emperor Norton. We celebrate. Yes.
So I think so. There was sort of a grandiosity to some of them, but they're still sort of telling maybe a narrative that feels protective or that is less wounding than saying, I have lost my memory and I'm in this place where I'm never going to recover it. You know, to say that I'm part of this grand adventure, I think there's something protective about that, perhaps.
Oh, it's making me sad just thinking about that a little bit. Okay, but there are lots of great questions. Okay, a lot of profound ideas and views come from challenged brains, like Virginia Woolf or a schizophrenic person. How do we honor these individuals, increase their visibility, and destigmatize them in our society? Once again, Virginia Woolf. Somebody else is interested.
Virginia Woolf, yes. I think there's a reason that Virginia Woolf writing about perception and feeling porous to the world, or Dostoevsky writing about his own experience of epilepsy, immortalizing it in the characters that he wrote. There's a reason that those texts have really persisted, and that we can all, read them regardless of whether or not we've shared that same experience. I think this kind of goes back to this idea that neurology is really universalizing. It's not about voyeurism. It's not about looking at something that is out of the realm of normal or ordinary. It's about revealing something that is true for all of our brains, and revealing it by seeing all of the ways that we are all frail and all of the ways that we can all be wounded. So I think just like having those narratives in the zeitgeist and being able to say that the spectrum of human experience is much vaster than this really narrow set of things that we call normal, I think is really powerful, and I hope is something that will persist and continue to expand and grow ever larger in ways that we can't even predict right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just something that comes to mind, and certainly in the Bay Area we have this, which are art centers and community gathering places where people who are neurologically challenged produce art and share their art with people in their communities. So anyways, that's something that comes to mind. Neurology is a field where uncertainty is unavoidable. So how can a doctor say, I don't know, without leaving a patient feeling abandoned? And in this moment of eroding trust in expertise, including doctors, we just had the testimony of Dr. Fauci, what would a more honest form of medical authority look like?
This is such a hard question, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts as a journalist about this as well, because this is I feel like a moment of eroding trust, not just in medicine, but in all shared versions of the truth.
True. Good point. Shared versions of the truth.
I don't have a great answer. I think that there is something that is precious about confessing uncertainty. I think there's something that feels humble and respectful about being able to say, this is what we know. These are the limits of what we know. I don't know whether your loved one is I cannot say for certain if your loved one will wake up or what they will look like when they do. But this is the range of possible outcomes, or this is the way that things could be. And just this idea of confessing that there is a degree of uncertainty. I wonder whether that would do something for public trust, or even confessing that science is a process, that we, this is what we know right now about this particular illness or this disease, and that might evolve with time. And science, again, has this element of narrative humility that allows us to keep iterating until we get closer and closer to some truth. This idea that maybe actually confessing uncertainty would make people feel more certain or more secure in institutions, but I don't know. This is a this is the new pandemic, I think, this pandemic of distrust, and I don't have a good solution for it.
Well, I have to say, reading The Mind Electric made me feel a great deal of optimism towards an authority like you as a neurologist, in that the empathy and sensitivity that you brought to this material and to your patients was very, very moving, Priya. So I just wanted to throw that into the mix as well. Okay, another question for you. Reviewers keep invoking Oliver Sacks in comparing The Mind Electric, your book, to his work, the late Oliver Sacks, I should say. You've credited him as an inspiration, but writing about patients raises some ethical questions about consent and exposure. So how did you decide what you owed the people in these pages that you wrote about?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and is, I think, rendered even more complicated by some of the recent revelations about Oliver Sacks's work and stories that he actually described himself as being like confabulations. This idea that this person who spent so much of his life writing about human cognitive frailties was just as vulnerable to them as anyone else. I think it's such an essential question, and I think one of the things that I cared the most deeply about when I was writing this book is that it felt really important that I had skin in the game as well, that I was revealing my own body, my own experiences, and that I really was honest with myself about what the perspective that I had was, which was not the perspective of anyone else's mind or anyone else's, and the chance to be inside anyone else's head. It was my own very biased and very particular perspective that I was looking out on the world through. And I wanted to make sure that I think there are so many medical stories that read like triumphs, or that read sort of heroically, and that's not my experience of medicine. That's not my experience of doctoring. And so I wanted to be very, very honest about the moments that I've gotten things wrong, the ways that I'm just as vulnerable to all of these confabulations and these biases as anyone else, in the way that doctoring is not this kind of objective, eyeless exercise that we imagine it to be. So I think having my own perspective and being as candid as possible about that, I think, felt very, very essential.
I thought it was extremely effective to weave in your own story and to make it very clear where you were coming from and your own experiences, pregnancy, your own uncertainties, the mistakes you made. It was just a great, great way to do it. You write, to bring me to the next question, you write very candidly about your own health, sleep deprivation in residency, a vascular malformation, and then pregnancy as well. So what changed in your doctoring or your writing once you'd been a patient in your story?
That is such a fantastic question. I think, so I'll start by saying that I started writing this book a few weeks after I had my first child. And so sleep deprivation was really at top of mind. And it really felt like an echo of my experience of residency, of my medical residency, where I was, working a 30-hour shift every couple of days and was inhabiting this brain that felt like it was not quite ill and not quite well, but somewhere kind of I was experiencing kind of something at the extremes of what it felt like my body could withstand. And so sleep deprivation was absolutely at the top of my mind. I think it just was important for me to realize that I was inhabiting a body that is as vulnerable as anyone else's. And just, I think as a resident, I can remember this feeling of never wanting of being more afraid of expressing a weakness or of confessing to some sort of physical frailty, being more afraid of that than of having something actually be wrong with my body. And that is, when you take a step back, that's a terrible way for a doctor to feel who's then going to be treating patients. I want my patients.
It's part of the system.
Yes, no, absolutely.
You are absorbing the lesson of the system. Don't admit frailty.
It's one of the things that I was fascinated by and would have spent many more pages writing about in this book was I spent some time thinking about the origins of medical residency programs. And so at the hospital where I trained, Johns Hopkins, medical residencies were born from these two two men, both named William Osler, William Halsted. William Halsted was this really famously kind of like cowboy surgeon who he was like really sort of he famously would take these massive risks. He operated on his own mother's gallbladder. He transfused his own blood into his sister, maybe the first successful blood transfusion that was ever done. But he also very famously had this insane schedule where he worked at something like 7 different hospitals. And you look at his schedule, he would go do surgery at one hospital. He would go see patients in another hospital, not clear when he ever slept. And he designed a training program for surgeons in training that was designed to replicate his own, this idea that he was able to kind of circumvent all of the frailties of a human body. And years after he died, we learned that, like many surgeons at the time, the reason he was able to do this was because he was addicted to cocaine the whole time. He didn't sleep. And it was this open secret that everyone knew. And yet we're still wedded to this idea that doctors can't be human because of this, this tradition of doctors who denied their own needs in the service of their medical practice.
Well, as your book, The Mind Electric, shows us, doctors can be incredibly human, and you brought, again, just enormous intelligence, warmth, and empathy to the world through your book. So thank you very much. Our thanks to Dr. Priya Anand, the author of The Mind Electric, a neurologist on the strangeness and wonder of our brains. We encourage you to pick up a copy of The Mind Electric here or at your local bookstore. And for information about the Commonwealth Club World Affairs membership and upcoming programs, please visit www.commonwealthclub.org. I'm Julia Flynn Seiler. Thank you and take care.
Thank you so much, Julia.